Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the warm, golden haze of an ancient Egyptian afternoon, where the sun presses down like a heavy hand and the Nile glimmers lazily in the distance. You're standing ankle-deep in dusty earth, surrounded by rows of workers who look like they've been here forever. And judging by their expressions, some of them feel like they have. A faint breeze drifts by, carrying the smell of mud, sweat, and freshly cut reeds. And somewhere nearby, someone is already complaining. Not about the heat, not about the work, but about someone else not working. Because, yes, long before office Slack channels or passive-aggressive emails, people here are already whispering about lazy coworkers. And you? You've just arrived, which means, naturally, you're about to get dragged into it. Now, quick reality check. You probably wouldn't survive this. Not because of lions or curses, but because the moment you pause to catch your breath, someone is absolutely going to report you for standing around like a decorative pillar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where in the world people are drifting off with these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift your weight as the ground crumbles slightly beneath your sandals, watching a line of workers haul baskets of soil. The rhythm is steady. Lift, carry, dump, repeat. But not everyone is moving in sync. A man a few steps ahead pauses just a little too long, wiping his brow with theatrical exhaustion. Immediately, the man behind him leans toward you, voice low but urgent. He does this every day, he mutters. Every single day. You haven't even introduced yourself yet, and already you're being recruited into workplace gossip. This, strangely enough, is one of the most human things about ancient Egypt. Despite the grandeur we often imagine, pyramids, pharaohs, gods with animal heads, the daily reality is full of ordinary frustrations. People get tired. People get annoyed. And most importantly, people notice when others aren't pulling their weight. Historians know this not from dramatic carvings or royal decrees, but from something much quieter. Everyday records. Ostraca, broken pieces of pottery used like scrap paper, are covered with notes, lists, and yes, complaints. Some of them are surprisingly blunt. One worker might simply be marked as absent. Another might have a note explaining why. And sometimes those reasons feel suspicious. The man beside you continues, clearly warming up now that he has an audience. Yesterday, he said his foot hurt. He whispers, nodding toward the slow worker. The day before, his wife was sick. Tomorrow, I'm sure the gods themselves will personally excuse him. You nod slowly, trying to look like you belong here, even though you're still figuring out how you got recruited into ancient office politics. Nearby, another group is stacking bricks with practiced efficiency. One of them glances over, then leans toward his own companion. You can't hear the words, but you don't need to. The sideways glance, the slight shake of the head, it's universal. Someone, somewhere, is always being judged for not doing enough. And here's the fascinating part. This wasn't just idle gossip. In many cases, these observations could turn into official records. Work crews were organized, monitored, and documented, especially during large state projects. If someone consistently underperformed, or was believed to, there could be consequences. Of course, that raises an important question. Historians still argue whether these complaints were always fair, or if they were sometimes exaggerated twisted or even weaponized by coworkers trying to look better themselves. You glance again at the lazy worker. He's still moving, just slower than the others. Is he truly slacking? Or is he just exhausted? Maybe he really does have a sore foot. Maybe his wife actually is sick. Or maybe, just maybe, he's mastered the ancient art of doing the bare minimum without getting caught. If so, honestly, kind of impressive. A small ripple of laughter breaks out nearby, quickly suppressed as a supervisor passes. The overseer doesn't shout or threaten, he simply watches. And somehow, that's worse. The workers straighten, movements sharpening, baskets lifted with renewed urgency. Even the slow man picks up his pace. Slightly. You notice how quickly behavior changes under observation. It's subtle, but unmistakable. This is a system built not just on labor, but on visibility. Everyone is watching everyone else, and that creates a perfect environment for complaints. A younger worker, barely older than a teenager, edges closer to you. "You're new," he says quietly. You nod. He gestures toward the group. Just don't be the slowest. That's the rule, apparently. Not be the best, not work the hardest. Just don't be the one people talk about. It's a low bar, and yet somehow incredibly stressful. You pick up a basket, feeling its rough edges press into your palms. It's heavier than it looks. Of course it is. Everything here is heavier than it looks. Work, expectations, even silence. As you fall into the rhythm, lift, carry, dump, you start to understand something important. The complaints aren't just about laziness. They're about fairness, about survival. If one person does less, someone else has to do more. And in a world where energy is limited and the sun never seems to give you a break, that matters. Still, the way people talk about it, there's a certain flair. At one point, the man beside you sighs dramatically and says, "If he worked any slower, he'd be moving backward." You almost laugh. Almost. Because beneath the humor, there's tension. Real tension. The kind that builds slowly, quietly, until it spills over into something more formal. Something written down. Something recorded. And that's where things get interesting. Because here, in this dusty field, among these tired, watchful workers, you're not just witnessing casual complaints. You're seeing the early stages of something much bigger. A system where frustration becomes documentation, where gossip becomes evidence, and where even the smallest act of laziness might end up preserved for thousands of years. Not exactly the kind of legacy most people are aiming for. As the sun inches lower, casting long shadows across the ground, the whispers don't stop. If anything, they grow softer, more deliberate. Plans are forming, observations are being stored away, and you realize, with a quiet sense of inevitability, someone is eventually going to write this all down. Hopefully, not about you. You settle into the rhythm of the work, though settle might be generous. It's more like you surrender to it. The basket in your hands feels heavier now, not because it's changed, but because your arms are starting to understand exactly what they've signed up for. Around you, the quiet hum of labor continues, punctuated by the occasional sigh, mutter, or suspiciously loud throat clearing that somehow always seems directed at someone else. And that someone else is still being watched. Not just by coworkers either. A short walk from the field, under the thin shade of a makeshift canopy, sits a figure who looks significantly less sweaty than everyone else. His posture is upright, almost relaxed, and in his hands is something that instantly draws your attention. Not a tool, not a basket, but a reed brush and a flat surface dusted with fine powder. A scribe. If the workers are the muscle of this world, the scribe is its memory. You find yourself glancing over more often than you probably should. There's something oddly mesmerizing about the way he works. Dipping the brush, making small, precise strokes, pausing occasionally as if considering whether someone's effort is worthy of documentation or complaint. Because that's the thing. These scribes aren't just recording grand events or royal decrees. They're keeping track of people, real people. Their attendance, their output, their excuses, their laziness. Historically, scribes were among the most respected professions in ancient Egypt. Literacy wasn't common, and the ability to read and write hieratic script placed you in a completely different social category. You didn't haul bricks. You didn't sweat under the sun. You sat, observed, and wrote. Which, if we're being honest, sounds like a pretty solid career move. One ancient text even praises the profession, claiming that a scribe's life is far better than that of a laborer. No backbreaking work, no blisters, just ink and authority. And right now, watching this man casually record the day's activities while everyone else struggles, it's hard to argue with that. You edge a little closer during a brief lull and pretending to adjust your grip on the basket. From this angle, you can just make out the marks on his writing surface. They're neat, efficient, almost clinical. A list of names. Next to some of them, small notations. Absent, sick, delayed, and occasionally, nothing at all, which somehow feels more ominous. A worker nearby leans in toward you again, clearly unable to resist commentary. "See him?" he whispers, nodding toward the scribe. He remembers everything. You glance back. The scribe doesn't look up. "Last week," the man continues, "someone said they had to attend a funeral. 2 days later, the scribe asked which relative it was." You blink. "And?" The worker shrugs. He couldn't remember. There's a pause. "That didn't go well." You try not to smile, but it's difficult. There's something almost modern about this. Like being caught in a lie during a meeting you thought no one was paying attention to. But here, the stakes feel different. Because once something is written down, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes part of a record. And in a society that values order and accountability, those records matter. Historians have uncovered numerous examples of these documents, especially from places like Deir el-Medina, a village of workers responsible for building royal tombs. There, attendance logs were kept with surprising detail. Workers weren't just marked absent, they were often given reasons. Some were legitimate, others a bit questionable. Brewing beer, arguing with his wife, bitten by a scorpion. Okay, that last one might actually be fair. Still, you can't help but notice how thin the line is between explanation and excuse. As you return to your spot, the slow worker from earlier is now moving with slightly more urgency. Not fast, exactly, but faster. Enough to avoid immediate attention. Or so he hopes. The scribe pauses, looks up briefly, and then makes a small mark. You don't know what it means, but you're pretty sure it's not a compliment. There's a quiet tension in the air now. Subtle but persistent. People are more aware of their movements, their pace, even their posture. It's not just about doing the work. It's about being seen doing the work. And maybe more importantly, not being seen doing too little. You start to understand why complaints here carry weight. It's not just idle chatter. It can influence what gets recorded, and what gets recorded can influence everything else. Rations, assignments, reputation. Reputation especially. A man with a reputation for laziness doesn't just face a few annoyed co-workers. He risks being overlooked, reassigned, or quietly pushed aside. And in a tightly structured labor system, that's not something you can easily recover from. Still, there's a certain creativity to how people navigate this. At one point, you overhear a worker explaining his absence from the previous day. "My donkey refused to move," he says, completely serious. The listener raises an eyebrow. "Your donkey?" "Yes." "Stubborn creature. Would not budge." There's a pause. "And you couldn't walk?" Another pause. "The donkey was very stubborn." You look away before you accidentally laugh out loud. This is where things get interesting again. Because while some excuses are clearly exaggerated, others might be genuine. Life here is unpredictable. Illness, family issues, environmental challenges. They're all real factors. Historians still argue whether the scribes recorded these reasons neutrally, or if their own biases shaped how they interpreted them. Did they roll their eyes internally at every sick day? Did they favor certain workers over others? Or were they, in their own way, just trying to make sense of a messy human system? You glance back at the scribe, who is now carefully cleaning his brush. There's no visible judgment on his face, just calm focus. But that doesn't mean judgment isn't happening, because the act of writing something down, anything, gives it a kind of permanence, a weight, even if the original moment was small, fleeting, or misunderstood. And here, in this sunlit field, surrounded by tired workers and quiet whispers, those small moments are constantly being created. A missed step, a delayed lift, a slightly longer break. Each one has the potential to become a note, a mark, a complaint. You shift the basket again, adjusting your grip, suddenly very aware of how you might look from a distance. Are you moving fast enough? Consistently enough? Are you giving anyone a reason to mention your name in a low voice? It's a strange feeling, being both participant and potential subject. But that's the nature of this place. Everyone is working, everyone is watching. And somewhere nearby, someone is always writing. The rhythm of the day carries on, but something has shifted, at least for you. It's no longer just about lifting and carrying. Now, every movement feels observed, not just by the overseer, not just by the scribe, but by everyone around you. And more importantly, everyone seems to be quietly building a case against someone else. Because if there's one thing you're starting to understand, it's this. In ancient Egypt, blaming your co-workers is practically an art form. You notice it first in the way people talk. Not directly, of course. No one walks up and says, "Hey, you're lazy." That would be far too simple and, honestly, far too risky. Instead, it's all subtle glances, carefully worded comments, and just enough implication to plant a seed. "You must be tired," one worker says, watching another slow down. Sounds sympathetic, right? But the tone says otherwise. You adjust your grip on the basket, pretending not to listen, while very much listening. "He's always tired," another replies. And just like that, a narrative begins. This is how it works. Not with loud accusations, but with quiet repetition. A comment here, an observation there. And suddenly someone isn't just having an off day, they're known for it. Reputation, you're learning, is incredibly fragile here. You glance over at the now familiar, slow worker. He's still moving, still carrying, still doing the same job as everyone else. But now you see him differently. Not because he's changed, but because of what you've heard. It's oddly effective. and a little unfair. Historians have found that workplace complaints in ancient Egypt often didn't come as dramatic confrontations, but as written notes or indirect reports. In some surviving records, workers are described in ways that feel suspiciously one-sided. Someone might be labeled as unreliable or absent frequently, but without context, it's hard to know the full story. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. Historians still argue whether some of these complaints were less about truth and more about strategy. Workers subtly undermining each other to gain favor, better assignments, or simply avoid being the next target. You wouldn't think of a construction site as a place for political maneuvering, but here you are. And it's not just words. At one point, you notice a man deliberately speeding up as the overseer approaches, only to slow down again the moment he passes. It's so smooth, so practiced, it almost feels like choreography. Performance matters, not constant effort, not quiet consistency, visibility. Another worker, older and clearly more experienced, leans toward you. "You're new?" he says again, as if confirming a theory. You nod. He gestures subtly with his chin. "Watch closely." You follow his gaze to a group stacking materials. One of them suddenly stumbles, dropping part of his load. It's not dramatic, just enough to cause a brief pause. Immediately, someone nearby sighs. Loudly. Too loudly. "Careful," he says, shaking his head. "We can all take breaks whenever we feel like it." The man who dropped the load stiffens. It slipped. Of course it did. There's a beat of silence, no argument, no escalation, but the message is clear. You realize what just happened. That wasn't just a comment. It was a positioning move, a subtle way of drawing attention to someone else's mistake while reinforcing your own diligence. And the worst part? It works. The overseer, who had been walking past, pauses just long enough to glance back. One small moment, one slightly longer look. That's all it takes. You shift uncomfortably. It's starting to feel less like teamwork and more like a very slow, very polite competition. And yet, there's humor in it too. At one point, you overhear a worker mutter, "If complaining were work, he'd be the most productive man here." You almost choke on a laugh, because honestly, that might be true. This constant low-level blaming isn't just about avoiding punishment. It's also a kind of social glue. Strange as it sounds, sharing complaints creates bonds. It gives people something to talk about, something to agree on. Can you believe him? No, I cannot. Connection achieved. It's oddly comforting in a slightly toxic way. Still, not all accusations stay subtle. Occasionally, things escalate. You witness one such moment when two workers begin arguing, not loudly, but with a sharp intensity that cuts through the usual background noise. "You left early yesterday," one says. "I was told to." "By who?" A pause. "It doesn't matter." "It does if I had to finish your work." There it is again, that core issue. Fairness. It keeps coming back to that. Because in a system where output is shared, imbalance is felt immediately. If one person does less, someone else does more. And that imbalance doesn't just disappear, it gets remembered. Sometimes quietly, sometimes not. You notice the scribe glancing up again, just briefly, before making another mark. You don't know what he's writing, but you're starting to understand how those marks come to be. Not from dramatic incidents, but from these small, accumulating moments. A complaint here, a disagreement there, a pattern forming over time. And once that pattern exists, it becomes very hard to escape. The older worker beside you exhales slowly. Best thing you can do, he says. You wait. Give them nothing to say. You look down at your hands, at the basket, at the dust clinging to your skin. That sounds simple. It isn't. Because here, even silence can be interpreted. Even neutrality can be suspicious. If you don't complain, are you hiding something? If you don't join in, are you above it? There's no perfect position, only less dangerous ones. A light breeze passes through, barely noticeable, but enough to shift the edge of your clothing. The sun has dipped slightly, though the heat still lingers. Work continues. So do the whispers. And you realize, with a quiet sense of inevitability, that this entire system, this web of observation, implication, and quiet blame, isn't just a side effect of the work. It's part of it, because in a place where everything is recorded, where every action might become a mark on a page, people adapt. They watch more closely. They speak more carefully. And when necessary, they blame just convincingly enough to stay out of the story themselves. You tighten your grip on the basket and step forward again, moving with just a little more precision than before. Not faster, not slower, just safely average. Because here, that might be the smartest strategy of all. By now, the rhythm of work and whisper has blended into something almost hypnotic. Lift, carry, observe, quietly judge, repeat. But as the afternoon stretches on, you begin to notice that some complaints don't just stay in the air. They don't fade with the heat or dissolve into the dust. Some of them get written down. It starts subtly. The older worker beside you nudges your elbow. Not enough to interrupt your balance, just enough to redirect your attention. Watch, he murmurs. You glance toward the shaded canopy where the scribe sits. A man has approached him. Not hurried, not nervous, just deliberate. He stands with the posture of someone who has already rehearsed what he's about to say. The scribe looks up, brush poised. And just like that, something informal becomes official. You shift your weight, trying not to stare, but it's hard not to. The man begins speaking in a low, measured tone. You can't hear every word, but you catch fragments. Consistently late. Leaves before the end. Others must finish. The scribe listens without interruption, then nods once and begins writing. That's it. No dramatic reaction, no questioning. Just a quiet acknowledgement and a few strokes of ink. But those strokes matter, because this isn't just gossip anymore. This is documentation. You feel a strange chill, despite the heat. There's something about seeing a complaint transformed into written form that makes it feel heavier, more permanent, like it's crossed an invisible line. The worker beside you exhales softly. Once it's on papyrus, he says, it's not just talk. You nod slowly. In ancient Egypt, papyrus wasn't used casually. It required effort to produce, and anything written on it carried a certain weight. While everyday notes might be scribbled on ostrasa, those broken pottery shards you heard about earlier, more formal complaints or records could find their way onto papyrus scrolls. And once there, they could be stored, referenced, even used later. Which means that a complaint made today might still matter tomorrow, or next week, or longer. Historians have uncovered documents that resemble what we might call workplace reports. Lists of worker absences, records of disputes, even notes about who failed to meet expectations. Some are surprisingly detailed, naming individuals and describing their behavior in ways that feel almost familiar, like early performance reviews. Except instead of a polite meeting in a quiet office, you get your reputation quietly inked into existence while standing in the sun. You watch as the man finishes speaking. The scribe makes a final mark, then looks up again. A brief exchange, a nod, and it's done. The man steps away, returning to the group as if nothing happened. But something did. You can feel it. The air around that slow worker, yes, the same one, seems slightly different now. Not visibly. No one points or whispers louder than before. But there's a subtle shift in how people look at him, as if something invisible has been confirmed. You wonder if he knows. Probably. Because in a place like this, word travels quickly, even when it's not spoken out loud. You pick up your basket again, but your mind is elsewhere. You're thinking about how easy it would be to do the same thing. To step away for a moment, approach the scribe, and quietly mention that someone else isn't doing their share. No confrontation, no risk. Just a conversation. It's almost too convenient. At one point, you overhear another pair of workers discussing it. He went to the scribe, one says. I saw. He shouldn't have. Why not? A pause. Because now it's written. There's a weight to that statement. Because once something is written, it can't be unwritten. Not easily. Not completely. Even if circumstances change, even if the complaint was exaggerated or misunderstood, the record remains. And records, in this world, have a way of shaping reality. You recall something you heard earlier about Deir el Medina, that worker village where detailed logs were kept. In those records, some workers are marked absent for reasons that feel oddly personal. Attending to family matters, dealing with illness, even participating in religious festivals. But occasionally, there are notes that hint at tension, at disputes, at someone not fulfilling their duties. And those notes don't explain everything. They don't capture tone or context, or whether the complaint came from frustration, jealousy, or genuine concern. They just exist. Historians still argue whether these written complaints reflect objective truth, or if they're filtered through the biases of those reporting them, and those recording them. Was the scribe simply a neutral observer? Or did he, consciously or not, shape the narrative? You glance back at the canopy. The scribe is already moving on, recording something else, his expression unchanged. It's impossible to tell. Meanwhile, the workers continue. But now, you notice something new. People are being more careful, not just in how they work, but in how they appear to work. Movements are slightly exaggerated. Effort is more visible. Breaks are shorter, or at least more discreet. It's as if everyone has collectively remembered that they might be one conversation away from becoming a line of text. A record, a complaint. You shift your posture, straightening slightly, making sure your next lift is clean, efficient, undeniable. Just in case. A faint chuckle drifts from nearby. Maybe I should report you. One worker jokes to another. Oh, please, the other replies. You'd miss me too much. There's laughter, soft, brief, quickly swallowed by the rhythm of work. Even here, humor finds a way in. But beneath it, the system hums steadily. Observation, interpretation, documentation. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's constant. And you're right in the middle of it. The sun dips a little lower, shadows stretching longer across the ground. The heat begins to ease, just slightly, and with it comes a strange sense of calm. Not because the complaints have stopped, but because you're starting to understand them. They're not random, not entirely. They're part of how this place functions, how it keeps track, how it enforces balance, however imperfectly. You glance once more at the scribe, then back at the workers around you. And for the first time, you realize something quietly unsettling. If you stayed here long enough, you might start doing it too. The sun has begun its slow descent, but the work doesn't soften with it. If anything, the urgency tightens. Like everyone suddenly remembers there's a finish line, even if no one quite agrees where it is. You fall back into rhythm, your arms now moving almost automatically, your mind free to wander. Which, in this place, mostly means noticing who's doing what. And more importantly, who isn't. Because now, you're no longer just a bystander to complaints. You're starting to recognize patterns. Certain names come up more often. Certain faces draw more glances. And in a project of this scale, where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of workers move together like a living machine, even a small disruption stands out. You look up, and for a moment, the scale of it all hits you. The structure rising in the distance isn't just impressive, it's overwhelming. Massive stone blocks, aligned with near impossible precision, forming something that feels less like a building and more like a statement. A promise that someone, somewhere, expects this to last forever. And here you are, arguing, well, quietly judging, over who carried fewer baskets today. There's something almost poetic about that. Historically, large construction projects in ancient Egypt, especially pyramids and temples, required highly organized labor forces. Contrary to the old myth of enslaved workers, many of these laborers were actually skilled and semi-skilled workers, organized into teams with names, identities, and yes, reputations. Teams even had names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkor, which honestly sounds like either a proud badge of honor or a very honest performance review. You imagine your own team name forming, Moderately Consistent Basket Carrier. Not exactly inspiring. You shift your grip and glance toward a nearby group hauling heavier loads. Their movements are tighter, more synchronized, almost disciplined. And yet, even among them, there are slight differences. Tiny hesitations, uneven pacing, subtle signs that not everyone is contributing equally. And just like before, people notice. A man near you clicks his tongue softly. He's slowing the whole line, he mutters, nodding toward one of the haulers. You follow his gaze. The worker in question doesn't look particularly lazy, just slightly out of sync. But here, that's enough. Because in a system built on coordination, even small inefficiencies ripple outward. You watch as the line adjusts around him, others compensating without saying a word. It's almost graceful, almost. But the tension is there. And tension, as you've learned, rarely stays quiet for long. At one point, a supervisor steps in, not aggressively, but firmly. He gestures, gives a few instructions, and the formation tightens. The slow worker straightens, quickens his pace. For now, the issue is contained. But you can already sense it lingering, because even when a problem is corrected, the memory of it remains. And that memory has a way of turning into something more permanent. You recall what you saw earlier, the man speaking to the scribe, the quiet transformation of complaint into record. And suddenly, this massive construction site doesn't just feel like a place of physical labor. It feels like a place of constant evaluation, not just by supervisors, by everyone. Historians have found graffiti left by work crews on stones used in pyramid construction, marks identifying which team worked on which block. These weren't just labels, they were signatures, proof of contribution. a way of saying, "We were here, we did this," which makes you wonder, what happens if someone doesn't do their part? There's no graffiti that says, "Carried slightly fewer stones than expected." But the absence of effort can still be felt, and more importantly, reported. You notice a small group taking a brief pause, just a moment to stretch, to breathe. One of them lingers a second too long. Immediately, a voice cuts in, light but pointed. Careful, or you'll need a written excuse for that. A few quiet chuckles. The man straightens, rejoining the rhythm. It's half joke, half warning, and everyone understands it. You begin to see how humor and pressure blend together here. Jokes aren't just for relief. They're also reminders, subtle signals about what's acceptable, what's risky, what might get noticed. At one point, someone says, "If the scribe starts writing about me, I'm moving to another village." "Good luck," another replies. They write there too. You can't help but smile, because it's true. This isn't just one place, it's a system. A culture of observation and record-keeping that stretches across projects, across regions, and wherever it exists. So do complaints. You glance again at the slow worker. He's still here, still working, still part of the flow. But now, he feels marked. Not visibly, not officially, not yet, but in the collective awareness of the group. You wonder how long that lasts. A day, a week, or longer. Historians still argue whether workers labeled as underperforming could recover their reputation easily, or if those early complaints followed them, shaping how others treated them over time. In a tightly knit labor force, perception can become reality surprisingly fast. You imagine what it would be like to carry that. To know that every movement you make is being compared to an idea of who you are. Lazy, reliable, inconsistent, hardworking, labels that start as whispers and end up as records. You adjust your pace again, subtly aligning with the workers around you. Not too fast, not too slow. Just enough to blend in, because blending in, you're realizing, is its own kind of skill, a survival skill. The sun dips lower, casting a warm, amber glow across the stones. The structure in the distance seems to soften in the light, its edges less harsh, its scale somehow even more impressive. And for a brief moment, everything feels almost peaceful. Until someone mutters, just loud enough to hear, "He missed another lift." You don't even need to look. You already know who they're talking about. And somewhere, not too far away, there's probably a space on a page waiting for that detail. The light softens, but the scrutiny doesn't. If anything, as the day stretches toward its end, people become even more aware of how they appear. Not just how much they've done, but how it looks like they've done it. You feel it in the way shoulders straighten when a supervisor walks past, in the slightly exaggerated lift of each basket, in the careful pacing that says, "Yes, I have been productive this entire time. Thank you very much." And then there are the supervisors themselves. They don't shout much. That's the surprising part. No dramatic yelling, no constant barking of orders. Instead, they move through the work site like quiet shadows, observing, noting, occasionally adjusting, which somehow is worse, because you never quite know when you're being evaluated. You spot one now, tall, composed, holding a staff that taps lightly against the ground as he walks. His eyes move steadily across the workers, not lingering too long on any one person, but not missing much either. You immediately become very interested in doing your job correctly. Around you, the same shift happens. Movements sharpen. Conversations fade. Even the whispers, those ever-present undercurrents of complaint, drop to a near silence. For a moment, everything looks perfect, efficient, coordinated, almost ideal. Then the supervisor pauses, not dramatically, just a slight halt in his step. His gaze settles on a group a few paces ahead. You follow it instinctively. There's nothing obviously wrong. The workers are moving, lifting, carrying. But one of them, just one, is slightly out of sync. A half-second delay, a fraction of hesitation. It's subtle. But here, subtle is enough. The supervisor doesn't say anything at first. He simply watches. And that, somehow, is more uncomfortable than any direct correction. Finally, he speaks. Keep the rhythm. That's it. No names, no accusations. Just a quiet instruction. But everyone understands who it's meant for. The worker adjusts immediately, sinking back into the flow. The line tightens, the movement smooths out, and the supervisor continues on as if nothing happened. And yet, something did. Because now, that moment exists. Not just in memory, but potentially in record. You glance toward the scribe again, half expecting to see him already writing it down. He isn't. At least, not yet. But you're starting to understand that not everything needs to be written immediately. Sometimes, patterns matter more than single incidents. And supervisors, unlike coworkers, are watching for patterns. This is where things become more structured. You begin to notice how work isn't just happening randomly. There are quotas, unspoken sometimes, but clearly understood. A certain number of loads, a certain pace, a certain level of consistency expected throughout the day. And when those expectations aren't met, well, that's when the quiet system of complaints starts to align with something more formal. The older worker beside you leans in again. They notice everything, he murmurs. You nod, not taking your eyes off your next movement. Not just what you do, he continues, but how often you do it. There's a pause, and how often you don't. You feel that one, because it's not about a single slow moment. It's about accumulation, repetition, the gradual building of a narrative. You remember the earlier whispers, the repeated comments about the same worker being always tired. And now, seeing how supervisors observe over time, it clicks. Those whispers might not be isolated. They might be reinforcing something already being noticed. Or worse, they might be helping create it. Historians have found that in organized labor communities like Deir el-Medina, overseers kept detailed records of worker attendance and productivity. These weren't just casual notes. They were structured logs, sometimes tracking who showed up, who didn't, and why. And occasionally, those reasons were interesting. Too drunk, quarreling with neighbor, making offerings to the gods. Which, to be fair, sounds like a pretty solid excuse. But again, the question lingers. Historians still argue whether supervisors relied solely on their own observations, or if worker complaints influenced what got recorded. Did a reputation, built through whispers, affect how a supervisor interpreted someone's behavior? It's hard to say. But standing here, watching how information flows between workers, supervisors, and scribes, it feels likely. You adjust your pace again, subtly aligning with the group. It's almost instinctive now. You're not just working, you're calibrating, matching speed, matching rhythm, avoiding any noticeable deviation. Because deviation is what gets noticed. And being noticed isn't always a good thing. A faint sound of laughter breaks the tension. Someone, somewhere, has made a joke. Quiet enough not to draw attention, but enough to ripple through a small group. You catch part of it, If I slow down any more, they'll assign me to the afterlife early. A few suppressed chuckles. Even here, humor survives. But it's careful humor, controlled, just like everything else. The supervisor passes again, his staff tapping lightly. This time, he doesn't pause. The line holds steady. The rhythm continues. For now, everything is acceptable. But you can feel the underlying pressure. It's not loud, not oppressive in an obvious way. It's subtle, constant. The knowledge that every action contributes to an invisible tally, a record of effort, or lack of it. You glance once more at the scribe, then back at the workers, then at the supervisor moving steadily through the space. 3 layers. Workers watching each other, supervisors watching the workers, scribes capturing what matters. It's a system, and like any system, it shapes behavior. You lift your next basket with just a bit more precision, step forward with just a bit more care. Not because you've been told to, but because you understand now. This isn't just about getting the work done, it's about how the work looks, how it's perceived, and ultimately, how it's remembered. The sun dips lower still, casting long shadows that stretch across the ground like quiet reminders of the day's passing. And as those shadows lengthen, so do the memories of every small moment, every hesitation, every complaint, every quiet observation, waiting, possibly, to be written down. By the time the light turns a deeper gold, the pace eases, just slightly. Not enough to call it rest, but enough that conversations begin to stretch a little longer, breaths a little deeper, and excuses a little more creative. Because if there's one thing you're about to discover, it's that ancient Egyptian workers were not just skilled laborers. They were masters of the excuse. You first hear it from a man 2 spots over, who is explaining, very earnestly, why he wasn't present earlier in the day. I had to stay home, he says, adjusting his grip as if the basket itself might support his argument. My wife was arguing with a neighbor. The listener tilts his head. And that required your presence? Yes, the man replies without hesitation. It was a very serious argument. There's a pause. You wait for a follow-up. There isn't one. And somehow, that makes it even better. You look away quickly, focusing on your next step, but the faint twitch at the corner of your mouth betrays you. This is how it goes. Not every absence is explained with solemnity or logic. Some are delivered with absolute confidence, as if the mere act of saying them makes them true. And in some cases, it might. Because here reasons matter, but so does how they're presented. Historically, we know that workers in places like Deir el-Medina had their absences recorded with surprising detail. These weren't vague notes. They were specific, personal, sometimes even oddly relatable. Sick. His wife was sick, making beer, bitten by a scorpion, attending a festival. One entry even notes a worker being absent because he was embalming his brother, which, to be fair, feels like a very valid reason to skip work. But then there are the others, the ones that make you pause, the ones that sound convenient. You overhear another conversation. I couldn't come yesterday, a younger worker says. My eye was hurting. Your eye? Yes. Just one? Yes. There's a beat of silence. You almost admire the commitment, because that's the thing. These excuses don't have to be perfect. They just have to be plausible enough to pass through the system without raising too many questions. And sometimes, that system is surprisingly forgiving. At least, at first. You begin to notice a pattern. A single absence, explained well, is often accepted, maybe even sympathized with. Life here is unpredictable. Illness happens, family issues arise, accidents occur. But repeated absences? That's where things start to shift. Because repetition turns explanation into suspicion, and suspicion turns into complaint. You glance again at the scribe. He's writing steadily, occasionally pausing, as if deciding how to phrase something. You wonder how he interprets these excuses. Does he take them at face value? Or does he, like everyone else, quietly categorize them? Legitimate, questionable, convenient. Historians still argue whether these recorded reasons reflect genuine circumstances, or if they sometimes served as socially acceptable cover stories. Ways for workers to justify absence without openly admitting fatigue, burnout, or simply needing a break. Because, let's be honest, after hours under this sun, carrying weight that seems to grow heavier with every step, who wouldn't want a day off? You certainly would. You shift your shoulders, feeling the strain settle in. Your arms ache in that dull, persistent way that suggests they'll still be complaining long after you stop. And suddenly, the idea of a sore eye doesn't seem so ridiculous. A worker nearby chuckles. Next time, I'll say I was attacked by a goose. Another snorts. Make it 2 geese. More convincing. You nearly laugh out loud. Because yes, even here people are aware of how their excuses sound. There's a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that not every reason is entirely airtight. And yet, the system continues, because proving otherwise isn't always easy. There's no medical note, no official verification, just words, memory, and the occasional follow-up question from a very attentive scribe. Which brings you back to something you heard earlier. Which relative? That simple question. It lingers, because it reveals something important. This isn't a system that blindly accepts everything. It listens, it remembers, and sometimes it checks. You wonder how many people get caught in their own stories. How many forget what they said the day before. How many underestimate just how closely they're being observed. You glance around again, noticing how people talk more carefully now. Not just about others, but about themselves. Excuses aren't thrown around casually. They're crafted, delivered with just enough detail to feel real, but not so much that they invite scrutiny. It's a delicate balance, and not everyone gets it right. At one point, a worker mutters, "He's sick again." The tone says everything. Not concern, not sympathy, just doubt. And that doubt spreads quickly, because once an excuse is questioned, it doesn't just affect that moment, it affects everything that comes after. Future absences become more suspicious. Future explanations are met with raised eyebrows. And eventually, they might not be believed at all. You realize that excuses here aren't just about avoiding work. They're about maintaining credibility. And credibility, once lost, is hard to regain. You adjust your pace again, keeping it steady, consistent, unremarkable. Because suddenly, being present feels like its own kind of protection. No explanation needed, no questions asked. Just quiet participation. The sun dips lower, the air cooling slightly, and the shadows stretch longer across the ground. The work continues, but the energy shifts. Less urgency, more endurance. And through it all, the quiet exchange of stories, reasons, and justifications continues. Some true, some less so. All of them part of a system that doesn't just track work. It tracks people, their habits, their patterns, their excuses. And somewhere, not too far away, A scribe is deciding which of those stories are worth writing down and which ones might come back later. As the day leans gently toward evening, the sharp edge of labor begins to soften, not in effort, but in tone. Voices drift a little more freely now, no longer pressed down by the constant presence of supervisors. And with that freedom comes something new, something you didn't fully expect. The complaints start to expand, not just about work, about life. Because here the line between the two is almost non-existent. You notice it first when a woman approaches the edge of the work area, carrying a small bundle. She speaks briefly with one of the workers, her voice low but animated. You can't hear every word, but the gestures say enough. Sharp movements, a pointed finger, a quick shake of the head. The worker sighs, rubbing his face. Again? Someone nearby mutters. The man nods, looking tired in a completely different way than before. Neighbor dispute, he says simply. And just like that, the world outside the worksite slips directly into it. Because in ancient Egypt, especially in worker communities like Deir el-Medina, life wasn't neatly divided into home and job. It was all intertwined. People lived close together, worked together, argued together. And when something went wrong at home, it followed you to work. Historians have found records showing that workers were sometimes absent due to domestic disputes, family responsibilities, or issues involving neighbors. These weren't rare occurrences. They were part of daily life, which means complaints didn't just come from coworkers, they came from everywhere. You shift your stance, watching as the man finishes speaking with the woman. She leaves, still shaking her head slightly, while he returns to the line with a resigned expression. "Everything all right?" someone asks. He hesitates. She says, "I didn't fix the roof properly." A pause. And now it leaks. Another pause. "So, you're here." A few quiet chuckles ripple through the group. The man shrugs. The roof can wait. You can't help but smile, because that logic feels timeless. But it also highlights something important. Responsibilities here overlap. Work doesn't exist in isolation. If someone is distracted, tired, or absent, it might not be because they're lazy. It might be because something else is pulling at them, something just as demanding. Still, not everyone sees it that way. You overhear a nearby comment. "He always has something going on," a worker says, shaking his head. Always. There it is again. Pattern, reputation. Even when the reasons are valid, repetition changes how they're perceived. You begin to realize that fairness here is complicated. It's not just about effort, it's about context. And context isn't always visible. A worker might be slower because he spent the night dealing with a family issue. Another might miss a day because of a religious obligation. Someone else might be distracted because of a dispute at home. But from the outside, it all looks the same. Less work, more burden on others. And that's where the complaints begin. At one point, you hear a woman's voice again, this time sharper, more insistent. "You said you would finish it." "I will." "When?" After what?" The conversation fades as they move further away. But the tension lingers. You glance at the worker beside you. He raises an eyebrow. "Better to stay here," he mutters. You nod, because somehow, even this, heat, labor, constant observation, feels simpler than navigating that. Still, the overlap between home and work creates a unique kind of complaint system. It's not just about who's lazy, it's about who's distracted, who's unreliable, who's bringing outside problems into a shared space. And those judgments aren't always fair. Historians still argue whether these domestic issues were recorded with the same weight as work-related absences. Did scribes treat arguing with wife differently from sick? Did supervisors show leniency? Or did they simply note the absence without context? It's hard to know. But standing here, listening to these conversations, it feels like everything blends together. Work, home, reputation. You notice a small group gathered slightly apart, speaking in low tones. One of them gestures animatedly, clearly frustrated. He left early again, he says. For what? His family. There's a pause. Of course. The tone isn't sympathetic. It's tired, because even valid reasons can become frustrating when they affect everyone else. You begin to see how easily empathy can turn into annoyance, how quickly understanding can shift into judgment, especially when the work doesn't stop. You adjust your grip on the basket, stepping forward with the line. The rhythm continues, steady as ever, but now layered with something deeper. Stories, complications, invisible burdens. At one point, someone jokes, "If my wife argues any louder, I'll need to report her to the scribe." A few laughs. "Make sure you include details." Another replies. He likes details. You shake your head slightly, amused. Because even in these moments, the presence of the scribe lingers, like an invisible thread connecting everything. Work complaints, domestic disputes, absences, excuses, all potentially recordable. You glance toward the canopy again. The scribe is still there, still writing, still calm, unmoved by the chaos around him, or at least appearing to be. And you wonder, if someone were to walk up right now and explain a domestic argument as the reason for missing work, would it be written down? And if it were, how would it be remembered? As a valid reason? Or just another line under someone's name? You step forward again, the ground shifting slightly beneath your feet. The air is cooler now, the light softer, the edges of the day beginning to blur. But the system remains, quiet, observant, always ready to turn even the most personal moment into something official. As the sun lowers into a softer, amber glow, something else begins to take center stage. Not the stones, not the baskets, not even the whispers. Food, or more specifically, who gets how much of it? Because if complaints about lazy coworkers simmer quietly throughout the day, arguments about rations, those can bubble up fast. You notice it when a worker opens a small bundle during a brief pause. Inside, bread, slightly coarse, and a container of beer. Thick, cloudy, more like a grainy drink than anything modern. It doesn't look like much. But here, it's everything. Bread and beer weren't just meals in ancient Egypt. They were wages. For many workers, especially those on state projects, rations formed a core part of their compensation. The amount you received could reflect your role, your status, and sometimes your perceived effort. Which means, naturally, people pay very close attention to who gets what. You sit nearby, watching as a few workers compare portions. "That's more than yesterday," one says, squinting. "No, it isn't." "It is. It's the same." A pause. "It's not the same." You almost admire the dedication. Because yes, even the smallest difference matters. And sometimes, those differences aren't imaginary. Historical records show that workers were often paid in standardized rations: bread, beer, occasionally onions or fish. But distribution wasn't always perfectly even. Delays could happen, supplies could fluctuate, and when they did, people noticed. Very quickly. You hear another voice cut in. "He was absent yesterday, and he still gets the same." The tone is sharp now, not curious, accusing. The man in question stiffened slightly. I had a reason. Everyone has a reason. There it is again. That line. You've heard it before. It seems to follow everything here, every excuse, every absence, every explanation. And now, it's tied to something tangible. Food. Because when someone receives the same ration despite doing less work or being absent, it doesn't just feel unfair. It feels personal. You take a small bite of the bread offered to you earlier. It's dense, a little dry, but filling. The beer is surprisingly thick, almost like a meal in itself. You can see why people care. This isn't a bonus. It's survival. A worker nearby leans toward you. Watch, he whispers. You follow his gaze to a small group gathered around a distribution point. A man is handing out portions, measured, deliberate. One worker steps forward, receives his share, moves on. Another steps up, receives his, then another. But when the slow worker, the now familiar figure, steps forward, there's a pause. It's brief, barely noticeable, but it's there. The man distributing the rations glances at him, and then at something beside him, perhaps a list, perhaps just memory. Then he hands over the portion, same as the others. But the moment lingers, because everyone saw it. And now, everyone is thinking the same thing. Should it have been the same? You hear the whispers start almost immediately. He shouldn't get that much. He barely worked. He's always like that. The narrative is already formed. You realize that rations don't just reflect work, they reinforce perceptions of work. If someone seen as lazy receives the same as everyone else, it doesn't feel like fairness. It feels like injustice, even if the system is technically consistent. And that's where things get complicated. Historians still argue whether ration distribution in ancient Egypt was strictly standardized, or if it could be adjusted based on performance, attendance, or status. Some records suggest consistency, while others hint at flexibility, especially in cases of repeated absence or misconduct. But standing here, watching these reactions, it's clear that perception matters just as much as reality. Because even if the system is fair, it has to feel fair, or people start talking. You overhear another exchange. If he gets the same as me, one worker says, why should I work harder? A dangerous question, because it cuts right to the core of motivation. If effort doesn't change outcome, what's the point? You shift slightly, the thought settling in your mind. It's not just about complaints anymore. It's about balance, about maintaining a system where people feel their work is recognized, even if only through bread and beer. A man nearby shrugs. Maybe he'll be written down. There's that again. The idea that fairness, if not enforced through rations, might be enforced through records, through complaints, through the scribe. You glance toward the canopy. The scribe is still there, still writing, still calm. But now, you see his role differently, not just as a recorder of events, but as a kind of equalizer, or at least a potential one. If someone consistently takes more than they give, maybe it won't show in today's rations, but it might show somewhere else, in a note, in a record, in a reputation that follows them. You take another sip of the thick beer, letting the taste settle. It's not refreshing in the modern sense, but it's sustaining. And suddenly, you understand why people care so much. Because this is what they're working for. Not glory, not legacy, just enough to keep going. And if that feels uneven, the complaints won't stay quiet for long. A worker finishes his portion and stands, stretching slightly. Tomorrow, he says, I'll work slower. Don't. Another replies quickly. Why not? A glance toward the scribe. That's why. You smile faintly, because even here, even in something as simple as food, the system loops back on itself. Work affects rations. Rations affect perception. Perception affects complaints. Complaints affect records. And records affect everything else. The sun dips lower, the sky deepening into warm shades of orange and gold. The day is nearing its end, but the conversations continue. Quieter now, but no less meaningful. You finish your portion, brushing crumbs from your hands, and as you step back into the rhythm of the group, you realize something quietly important. In this place, fairness isn't just measured in effort. It's measured in bread, in beer, and in the stories people tell about who deserves them. The air cools just enough to feel like a reward, even though the work never truly stops. The light fades into a softer amber, shadows stretching long across the ground like the day itself is slowly exhaling. And in that quieter space between effort and rest, something else begins to surface. Not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. Resistance. You don't notice it at first. It's not obvious. No one throws down tools or storms off in protest. That would be far too direct, far too dangerous. Instead, it shows up in smaller ways. A slightly slower pace, a longer pause between lifts, a shared glance between workers that lingers just a little too long. You feel it before you fully understand it. A shift in rhythm. You look around. The line is still moving, but something is off. Not enough to stop the work, but enough to change its texture. What's happening? You whisper. The older worker beside you doesn't look at you. Nothing, he says. A beat. Exactly. You blink, and then it clicks. This isn't a protest in the way you might expect. This is a slowdown, a quiet, collective adjustment of effort. Just enough to be noticed, not enough to be punished immediately. You watch more closely now. The slow worker, yes, him again, is moving at the same pace as before. But now, others are matching him, deliberately, subtly, almost as if they've agreed, without speaking, to level the field. If one person is perceived as doing less, then everyone does a little less. You feel a strange mix of admiration and anxiety, because this is clever and risky. Historically, this kind of behavior isn't entirely unfamiliar. In fact, ancient Egypt provides one of the earliest recorded labor strikes in history during the reign of Ramesses III. Workers at Deir el-Medina, frustrated by delayed rations, stopped working and demanded what they were owed. Not violently, but firmly. They sat. They waited. They refused to continue until things were addressed. And remarkably, it worked. But what you're seeing now isn't that kind of open defiance. This is quieter, more controlled, kind of unspoken agreement. You overhear a whisper. If he gets the same, why rush? Another voice replies, let them see. There's no need to say more, because the message is clear. If fairness isn't enforced from above, it might be adjusted from below. You shift your own pace, almost unconsciously. Not slower, just aligned, matching the subtle change around you, because standing out in either direction feels dangerous. Too fast, and you draw attention. Too slow, and you become the next topic of conversation. So you settle into something in between. Safe, unremarkable. The supervisor passes again, his staff tapping lightly. This time, he pauses longer. His gaze moves across the line, taking in the slightly altered rhythm. He doesn't speak immediately. He just watches. And somehow, that silence feels heavier than any command. Because now, The slowdown is visible, not obvious, but noticeable. You feel your heartbeat pick up slightly, not from exertion, but from awareness. This is the moment where things could shift. The supervisor steps forward. "Keep steady," he says. Not harsh, not loud, but firm. The line adjusts, just a fraction. Enough to respond, not enough to completely undo what just happened. Because once a pattern begins, it doesn't disappear instantly. It lingers. You notice the exchange of glances again. Brief, subtle, but meaningful. This isn't over. It's just paused. Historians still argue whether these smaller, informal slowdowns were common in ancient labor systems, or if most resistance only appeared in more documented events like strikes. But standing here, watching this quiet coordination unfold, it feels almost inevitable. Because wherever there's a system, there's adaptation. And wherever there's perceived unfairness, there's response. Even if that response is as simple as doing a little less. You hear a soft chuckle behind you. "If we go any slower," someone murmurs, "we'll start going backward." "Careful," another replies. "They might write that down." A few quiet laughs ripple through the group. Even now, humor threads its way through tension. But beneath it, the message remains. People are paying attention, not just to each other, but to the system itself. You glance toward the scribe again. He's writing, as always, but you can't tell if he's noticed the shift. If he has, it doesn't show. And that's almost more unsettling, because not everything needs to be recorded immediately. Sometimes, it's enough that it's seen. You continue working, your movement steady, your pace measured. The rhythm begins to normalize again, slowly returning to its earlier pattern. But the memory of that slowdown stays with you. A reminder that even in a place built on order, control, and documentation, people still find ways to push back, quietly, carefully, together. The sun dips closer to the horizon now, the sky deepening into richer tones. The day is nearly done, but the energy has shifted again. Less about effort, more about endurance. And beneath it all, something else lingers. A shared understanding that fairness isn't just given. Sometimes it's negotiated, even if no one ever says it out loud. The sky deepens into a muted orange, and with it comes a strange kind of quiet. Not silence, but something softer, more reflective. The pace has steadied again after that subtle slowdown, but the memory of it lingers, like footprints in dust that haven't quite been erased. And now, something else begins to surface. Not complaints, not excuses, but oaths. You notice it when a worker near you suddenly raises his hand slightly, palm open, as if appealing to something unseen. "I swear by Amun," he says firmly. "I did my share." The tone is different from the usual murmurs and mutters. It's not casual, it's not joking, it's serious. And immediately, the conversation around him shifts. Because invoking a god here isn't just dramatic flair. It means something. In ancient Egypt, religion isn't separate from daily life. It's woven into everything. Work, family, justice, truth, all of it exists under the watchful presence of the gods. And when someone swears by a deity, especially a major one like Amun or Ra, they're not just making a statement. They're putting their credibility on the line. You glance at the others nearby. Some nod slightly. Others remain neutral. No one laughs. Because this isn't a joke. A man responds, arms crossed. "Then why were you behind this morning?" The first worker doesn't hesitate. "I was delayed." "By what?" A pause. by something that needed to be done. Not the strongest answer. And yet, the oath still hangs in the air. You feel it, that subtle tension between belief and doubt. Because here, truth isn't just measured by observation, it's tied to something higher, something moral. You've heard of this before. The concept of ma'at, the idea of balance, truth, and order that underpins Egyptian society. To live in accordance with ma'at is to be honest, just, and in harmony with the world. And to lie, especially while invoking the gods, that's not just risky, it's dangerous, at least in theory. Historians have found that oaths and religious language were sometimes used in disputes, both formal and informal. People would swear by deities to assert their innocence or to strengthen their claims. But here's the question. Did everyone always mean it? Or did some people use it strategically? Historians still argue whether these oaths were always sincere expressions of belief, or if they sometimes functioned as tools, ways to shut down accusations, to add weight to a statement that might otherwise be questioned. Because let's be honest, if someone says, "I swear by the gods," it's a lot harder to casually dismiss them, even if you're not entirely convinced. You watch as the conversation continues. "I saw you slow down," the second man says. "I did not." "You did." "I swear I did not." There it is again. The oath, repeated, reinforced, almost like layering protection over a fragile argument. You shift slightly, feeling the weight of it all. Because this isn't just about who worked harder or who carried more. It's about truth. Or at least, the version of it that people are willing to defend. A worker beside you leans in, whispering just loud enough to hear. He swears a lot. You glance at him. That's not always a good sign. You almost smile. Because yes, even here people recognize patterns. Someone who constantly invokes the gods might not be seen as more trustworthy. They might be seen as trying too hard. Still, the presence of these oaths changes the tone of complaints. It raises the stakes, turns casual accusations into something more serious, more consequential. Because now, it's not just about being labeled lazy. It's about being seen as dishonest. And that carries a different kind of weight. You recall something you learned earlier. How scribes record not just actions, but sometimes disputes. If a disagreement escalates, if it becomes formal enough, it might be written down. And if that dispute involves conflicting claims, who gets believed? The one who swore by the gods, or the one with a more consistent record? You glance toward the scribe again, half expecting him to be capturing this moment. He isn't. But that doesn't mean it won't matter later. Because these interactions build over time. They shape perception. And perception, as you've seen, often becomes reality. A breeze passes through, cooler now, carrying the faint scent of the Nile. The day is almost over, but the conversations continue, quieter, more deliberate. You hear another voice. "I don't need to swear," a worker says. "My work speaks for itself." There's a pause, then a soft reply. "Then maybe it should speak louder." A few muted chuckles. Even in seriousness, humor finds its way in. But beneath it, the message remains. Words matter, but actions matter more, at least ideally. You adjust your stance, lifting your next basket with steady hands. You don't swear anything, you don't make claims, you just work. Because right now that feels like the safest option. No exaggeration, no defense needed, just quiet consistency. The sky deepens further, the light fading into softer tones. Shadows stretch and blend, and the sharp edges of the day begin to blur. But the system remains. Observation, interpretation, and now, assertion. People don't just complain. They defend. They justify. They swear. And somewhere in that mix, truth gets shaped. Slowly, subtly, influenced by memory, perception, and the quiet weight of belief. You step forward again, the ground cool beneath your feet. And you realize something quietly fascinating. In a place where everything might be written down. Even the truth isn't always simple. The last stretch of the day settles in like a long exhale. The heat has faded, the sky now a dusky blend of gold and soft blue. And the work, though still ongoing, feels heavier in a different way. Not physically, but mentally. Because by now, you're not just carrying baskets. You're carrying awareness of who's watching, of what's been said, of what might be remembered, and more importantly, of what might follow you. You notice it in the way people talk now, quieter, more careful, as if the weight of the day's small moments has begun to settle into something more permanent. Because here, reputation doesn't reset at sunset. It lingers. A worker nearby wipes his hands on his garment, glancing toward the group. "They're talking about him again," he mutters. You don't even need to ask who. The slow worker. Still present, still working, still discussed. It's almost impressive in a way. One day of slightly slower movement, a few whispers, one possible complaint. And suddenly, he's become a reference point. A benchmark, not for excellence, but for what not to be. You glance at him. He looks the same as before. Tired, focused, not particularly remarkable. And yet, in the invisible network of perception surrounding this place, he's become something else entirely. A story, and stories spread. That's the part that surprises you most. Not the complaints themselves, but how they travel. From one worker to another. From a whisper to a shared understanding. From a shared understanding to something that feels accepted. You overhear someone new, someone who wasn't even near earlier, say, "He never keeps up." Never. A strong word. A permanent one. And you know, with quiet certainty, that it didn't start that way. It started with today, then again, then always. This is how reputations form, not from one moment, but from the repetition of a narrative. And once that narrative takes hold, it's hard to undo. Historians have found that in tightly knit worker communities, reputation played a significant role in how individuals were treated, not just socially, but professionally. A worker known for reliability might be trusted with better tasks. One known for inconsistency might be overlooked or quietly assigned less favorable roles. But what defines that reputation? Actual behavior or collective perception? Historians still argue whether these reputations were always accurate reflections of performance, or if they were sometimes shaped and distorted by gossip, bias, and repeated complaints. Standing here, listening to the way people talk, it's hard not to suspect the latter plays a role, because once a label sticks, people start seeing it everywhere. You notice how even neutral actions are interpreted through that lens now. The slow worker pauses briefly to adjust his grip. He's slowing again, someone mutters. But you've seen others pause too. No one comments on them, because they're not part of the story. You feel a quiet unease settle in, because this isn't just about him. It could be about anyone, at any time. A single moment, repeated often enough in conversation, becomes identity. And identity is hard to escape. You hear another voice, softer this time. "They wrote about him." You glance over. Did they? "I think so." That uncertainty doesn't matter, because the idea alone is enough. Once people believe something has been recorded, officially, permanently, it reinforces everything else, even if it's not entirely true. You think back to the scribe, to the quiet act of writing, to the way ink turns moments into memory. And you realize something important. The written record isn't the only record that matters. There's also the social one, the unwritten, constantly evolving story that people carry in their heads and share with each other. And sometimes, that one spreads faster. A worker chuckles quietly. Better to be invisible, he says. Too late for him. A few murmured agreements. You shift slightly, absorbing that idea. Invisible. Not unnoticed, but unremarkable. Free from attention. Free from narrative. It sounds appealing. Because here, attention isn't always positive. Being known can mean being watched, being discussed, being remembered for the wrong reasons. You adjust your pace again, carefully aligning with the group. Not leading, not lagging. Just blending. Because blending in feels like safety. The sky darkens further, the first hints of evening settling in. The work begins to slow naturally now, not from resistance, but from the simple fact that the day is ending. But the conversations don't stop. They soften. They linger. They carry forward. You hear someone say, "Tomorrow we'll see if he keeps up." A test, an expectation, a continuation of the story. Because reputations aren't just built, they're maintained, or challenged, or reinforced. You wonder what tomorrow will look like for him. Will he work harder? Faster? Will he try to change the narrative? And if he does, will anyone notice? Or has the story already been written? You glance once more at the scribe, then back at the workers, then at the fading light. And it becomes clear. In this place, consequences don't always come as punishment. Sometimes they come as perception, as whispers, as quiet agreements about who someone is. And once those agreements take hold, they can follow you longer than any written record ever could. The light fades into a gentle blue, and with it, the sharp edges of the day begin to soften. The baskets feel lighter now. Not because they are, but because your body has accepted them as part of its rhythm. The voices around you drift into a quieter tone, less urgent, more reflective, and strangely, more humorous. Because after a full day of watching, judging, whispering, and quietly navigating this delicate social maze, something else emerges, a kind of shared amusement. Not loud, not disruptive, just a subtle recognition that all of this, every complaint, every excuse, every carefully timed pause, is, in its own way, a little ridiculous. You hear it in a soft chuckle behind you. He said his foot hurt again. Same foot? Yes. Impressive. You smile faintly, because even here, after everything, people can still laugh. And maybe they have to. Because without that release, the constant observation, the quiet pressure, the endless balancing of effort and perception, it would be exhausting in a completely different way. You notice how the tone of the complaints has shifted. They're still there, still present, but they've softened. Less sharp, less accusatory, more observational. He's consistent, at least, someone says. In what? In being inconsistent. A few quiet laughs. It's not cruel, not exactly. It's more like a shared understanding, a way of acknowledging the patterns without letting them completely dominate the atmosphere. You realize something important. Complaints here aren't just about frustration. They're also about storytelling. Each comment adds a layer, a detail, a bit of personality to the people around you. Over time, these layers build into something almost narrative-like. The hard-working one, the unreliable one, the one with endless excuses, the one who swears by the gods too often. It's like everyone has a role, and whether they like it or not, they play it. Historians have found that many of the surviving records from ancient Egypt, especially informal ones, contain moments of humor, irony, and even sarcasm. Scribal exercises sometimes included playful or exaggerated scenarios, and everyday notes occasionally reveal a dry wit that feels surprisingly modern, which suggests something comforting, that even in a highly structured, deeply religious, and often demanding society, people still found ways to laugh at themselves and each other. You hear another exchange. "If I wrote everything he said," one worker jokes, "I'd need more papyrus." "Careful," another replies. "The scribe might hear you and make you do it." You shake your head slightly, amused, because the scribe, once again, sits quietly in the background, present but almost part of the scenery now. And yet, his role ties everything together. Every joke about complaints, every exaggeration, every whispered observation, all of it exists in relation to the possibility of being written down. You glance toward him. He's finishing something, brushing carefully, as if closing a chapter of the day. You wonder what's on that page. Names, absences, notes, maybe even a complaint or two. Condensed versions of everything you've just experienced, stripped of tone, of humor, of context. Just facts, or at least what passes for facts. Historians still argue whether these records capture the full reality of daily life, or if they present a simplified version, one that misses the nuance, the jokes, the small human moments that don't translate easily into writing. Standing here, you're inclined to believe the latter, because so much of what you've seen today exists between the lines, in glances, in tone, in timing, things that can't be easily recorded, but are deeply felt. You notice the workers beginning to slow naturally now, not out of resistance, but because the day is ending. Movements become less precise, more relaxed. The urgency fades, and with it, the need to constantly perform. At least, for now. A man stretches, rolling his shoulders. "We survived another day," he says. "Barely," someone replies. A few soft laughs. You feel it too, that quiet sense of completion. Not triumph, not pride, just relief. Relief that the work is done, that the watching might ease, that the whispers might quiet. Though you suspect they won't disappear entirely. Because these stories don't end with the day. They carry over into tomorrow, into the next conversation, into the next complaint. You hear one last comment as the group begins to disperse slightly. Let's see what he does tomorrow. Always forward-looking, always continuing the narrative. You glance once more at the slow worker. He's still there, still part of the group, still moving with the same steady pace. And you wonder, does he know? Does he feel the weight of the story forming around him? Or is he simply tired? You may never know. And maybe that's the point. Because here in this quiet blend of work, observation, and storytelling, certainty is rare. What exists instead is interpretation. And interpretation can be surprisingly flexible. You take a slow breath, the cooler evening air settling in your lungs. The sky above has deepened further, the last light fading gently. And for a moment, everything feels still, not silent, but calm. The complaints haven't disappeared. They've just softened, blended into something almost human. Less about accusation, more about understanding, or at least acceptance You adjust your stance, setting down the last of your load, and let your shoulders relax for the first time in what feels like hours. And as the day finally begins to let go of you, you realize something quietly comforting, that even in a world of constant watching, recording, and judging, people still find ways to laugh. And sometimes, that's enough. The work site slowly loosens its grip on the day, like a hand finally unclenching after holding something too long. Movements become slower, less deliberate. The baskets are set down more gently now, not dropped, not rushed, just released. And with that release, something else arrives. Stillness. Not complete silence. There are still footsteps, quiet voices, the faint rustle of fabric. But compared to the constant rhythm of the day, it feels almost like stepping into another world. You find yourself drifting toward the edge of the work area, where the ground slopes gently toward the Nile. The river catches what little light remains, reflecting it in soft, rippling patterns that seem to move slower than everything else around you. It's calming, almost hypnotic. Around you, small groups begin to form, not for work, not for coordination, but simply to exist together without the pressure of being watched every second. Or at least, watched less. You sit down on a low patch of earth, stretching your arms slightly, feeling the quiet ache settle into something manageable. Nearby, a few workers gather, their voices low, no longer edged with tension. And naturally, the stories return, not as sharp complaints, but as reflections. He really thought no one would notice, one says, shaking his head with a faint smile. Everyone notices, another replies. A simple truth. You listen as they talk, not with the urgency of earlier, but with a kind of tired amusement. The same events, the same moments from the day, now retold with softer edges. The slow steps, the exaggerated excuses, the carefully timed pauses, they're still there. But now, they feel less like problems and more like shared experiences, almost like inside jokes. You realize something quietly interesting. Distance changes everything. What felt frustrating in the moment now feels manageable, even a little funny. A man chuckles. Tomorrow, he'll say his other foot hurts. Of course, someone replies. Balance is important. A few quiet laughs ripple through the group. You smile, letting the sound settle in, because this is a different kind of connection, not built on pressure, but on recognition of shared effort, shared observation, shared humanity. You glance toward the river again, watching the slow movement of water. It doesn't rush. It doesn't strain. It simply flows, steady and constant, untouched by the small dramas of the day. And for a moment, you wonder what it would be like to be like that. Unconcerned with perception, unbothered by whispers, just moving. But then a voice pulls you back. Do you think they wrote about him? The question hangs in the air. Someone shrugs. Maybe. Probably. It doesn't matter, another adds. People already know. There it is again. That quiet acknowledgement that the written record is only part of the story. The rest lives here. In memory, in conversation, in the way people look at each other. You lean back slightly, resting your hands against the ground. The earth is cooler now, the heat of the day fading into something more comfortable. And yet, the thoughts linger, because even in this calmer space, the patterns remain. Observation, interpretation, storytelling. They don't stop when the work ends. They just change tone. Historians have long studied sites like Deir el-Medina not just for their official records, but for the glimpses they offer into daily life. Letters, notes, informal writings that reveal how people interacted, how they thought, how they felt about one another. And what emerges is something surprisingly familiar. People complained, people joked, people remembered, and above all, people talked. You hear another voice, quieter this time. I think he just gets tired. A pause. Don't we all? No one responds immediately, because that one lands differently. It cuts through the narrative, through the labels, through the repeated stories. And for a moment, the slow worker isn't a character. He's just a person, tired, like everyone else. You feel something shift inside you, not dramatically, not enough to change everything, but enough to soften the edges. Because it's easy to follow the story, to accept the pattern, to repeat what you've heard. But it's harder to step back and see the whole picture. To remember that every complaint, every label, every quiet judgment is built on moments you might not fully understand. The sky darkens further, the last traces of light slipping away. The river becomes a darker mirror now, reflecting the first faint hints of stars. Around you, the conversations begin to fade. Not abruptly, just naturally. Like a fire slowly burning down, people shift, stand, stretch, preparing to leave. The day is done, but the stories, they'll continue. Tomorrow, the same rhythms will return, the same observations, the same complaints, maybe even the same jokes. You rise slowly, brushing dust from your hands. Your body feels heavy, but your mind is quieter now, less focused on who did what, more aware of how it all fits together. You take one last look at the river, then back at the work site, now calmer, softer, almost peaceful. And you realize something quietly reassuring, that even in a place filled with constant observation, quiet judgment, and the possibility of being remembered for the smallest things, there are still moments like this. Moments where everything slows, where the noise fades, where the stories lose their sharpness, and all that remains is the simple feeling of being part of something shared. The last of the light slips quietly beneath the horizon, and with it, the world softens into shadow. The work site, once full of motion and quiet tension, now feels distant, like something you've stepped away from rather than something you're still inside. You move slowly with the others, no longer in formation, no longer bound by rhythm or expectation. Just a group of people walking, breathing, letting the day settle into memory. The air is cooler now, gentler, and the voices around you have faded into something softer, almost indistinct, like echoes that don't quite want to disappear. You hear fragments. Tomorrow, we'll see. He might. Always forward, always continuing. Because even as the day ends, the stories don't. They stretch quietly into the next one. You walk a little apart now, letting the distance grow just enough to think. The ground beneath your feet feels different, less urgent, less demanding. Each step is lighter, not because you're less tired, but because there's nothing left to prove. No one is watching, or at least, not in the same way. You glance back once, just briefly. The work site is still there, outlined faintly against the darkening sky. The structures, the tools, the spaces where everything happened, they haven't changed. But the energy has. The tension has dissolved into something quieter, something almost peaceful. And yet, you know it's temporary, because tomorrow it will all return. The rhythm, the observation, the whispers, the careful balancing of effort and perception, the small, accumulating moments that turn into stories, and eventually into something that lasts longer than the day itself. You think about the scribe, still somewhere behind you, perhaps finishing the last lines of the day. Small marks on a surface, each one representing a piece of what you've just lived through. Names, absences, notes, fragments of reality, captured in a way that will outlast the voices that created them. But even those records, as permanent as they seem, don't hold everything. They can't capture the tone of a whisper, the weight of a glance, the quiet humor shared at the end of a long day. They can't fully explain why someone slowed down, or why someone else noticed, or how a single comment became a story that followed a person from morning to night. Historians still argue whether these records give us a complete picture of daily life, or just a framework. A structure filled in by interpretation, assumption, and imagination. And standing here, you understand why. Because what you've experienced today isn't just a list of events. It's a web of perception, of memory, of quiet, human complexity. You pass by a small group lingering near the path. He's not that bad, one says. A pause. He just falls behind. Another voice responds, softer. That happens. There's no argument, no pushback, just acceptance. And for a moment, the story shifts again, not erased, but softened. You feel that softness settle into you as well. Because after a full day of watching, judging, and quietly navigating the same patterns as everyone else, it's almost a relief to let go of it. To stop analyzing, to stop comparing, to just be. The path ahead grows darker, lit only by the faint glow of the sky and the distant shimmer of the Nile. The sounds of the day fade further, replaced by the quiet rhythm of footsteps and the occasional murmur that drifts in and out like a breeze. You slow your pace slightly, not out of necessity, but because there's no reason not to. No urgency, no expectation, just the gentle continuation of movement. And in that space, your thoughts begin to quiet as well. The complaints, the excuses, the careful observations, they all begin to blur together, losing their sharp edges, becoming less important. You think back to the beginning of the day, to the first whisper, the first glance, the first moment you realized how closely everyone was watching. And now, it all feels distant, not gone, but quieter, less immediate, more like something you can observe without being pulled into. You take a slow breath, the cool air filling your lungs, and let it out just as slowly. The night settles in fully now, wrapping everything in a calm, steady darkness. And with it comes a sense of closure. Not dramatic, not final, just gentle. Like the end of a story that doesn't need a strong ending, because it will continue in another day, in another set of whispers, in another quiet complaint about someone who isn't quite keeping up. But for now, you don't need to follow that. You don't need to think about who did what, or who said what, or what might be written down tomorrow. All of that can wait. Instead, you let your focus drift to the sound of the river in the distance, to the soft rhythm of footsteps around you, to the quiet, steady presence of the night itself. Everything slows, everything softens, and the details of the day, so sharp, so important just hours ago, begin to fade into something lighter, something easier to carry. You feel your shoulders relax, your steps become more effortless, your thoughts less tangled. And as you continue forward, the world around you grows quieter still. The voices fade, the movement slows, the edges blur, until all that remains is a gentle sense of being here, and then gradually, not needing to be anywhere at all. And somewhere behind you, in the quiet stillness of a dimly lit space, a scribe finishes the last line of the day. A small mark, a final note. A piece of something that once felt important, now resting, like everything else. And as the night fully settles, wrapping the world in calm and shadow, you let go of the last thoughts of work, of whispers, of records and reputations. Let them drift. Let them soften. Let them fade. And simply follow the quiet rhythm of the night, deeper and slower, until even that fades into stillness. The night deepens gently around you, and there's nothing left to do, nowhere left to be. The river moves in its own slow, endless rhythm, untouched by the small concerns of the day. The voices you heard, the complaints, the quiet judgments, they dissolve now into something distant, almost dreamlike. You no longer need to hold on to them. Your steps grow lighter, softer, until even the feeling of walking seems to fade. The air is cool, steady, comforting in its stillness. Every thought that once felt sharp now drifts apart, like grains of sand slipping quietly through your fingers. There is no need to follow them, no need to understand them. The stories of the day settle into silence, not gone, but resting, like everything else in this quiet world. And in that stillness, you find a gentle kind of peace. No watching, no recording, no expectations. Just the slow, calm passage of time. So you let yourself drift with it, slowly, easily, without effort. And as the night wraps around everything, soft and endless, you sink deeper into that calm, where even the echoes of ancient voices finally fall quiet.